Welcome to our monthly ACTS Town Hall. Thanks to our member companies for helping make these town halls possible. Your support makes our mission a reality. Together in safety, stronger in collaboration. The ACTS Town Halls are an open forum to discuss concerns and present potential solutions to improve damage prevention and excavation safety. These town halls are meant to be a discussion, and you're encouraged to ask questions and share solutions. A recording of this town hall will be posted on our YouTube channel and sent via email after the town hall has concluded. Before the end of the town hall, each of our panelists will highlight a moving forward step to ensure we stay focused on practical and impactful solutions. We are pleased to have a knowledgeable and experienced panel with us today. So to get us started, our moderator will begin with brief introductions.
Thanks for everyone for joining this town hall. The topic is abandoned utilities, still kicking the can down the road. I'm Jimmy Wang, your host with BizMetrics LLC. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and the company and what they do there. Let's start with Mary So, please.
Yes, my name is Mary Logan So. I'm the Vice President of Safety and Employee Development for the George J. Igo and Company Incorporated. We're a heavy civil contractor, about 1,000 employees based out of Columbus, Ohio. I also serve as the contractor representative to the Ohio 811 board, and I currently chair the Abandoned Line Subcommittee for the Ohio Underground Damage Prevention Coalition.
Good morning, everyone. Pat Dunham. I'm the manager of damage prevention here at PECO, just in the Philadelphia area. We are an Exelon company. So I have about 10 damage prevention inspectors, supervisor. We have 6 vac trucks, a gas camera crew. These all operate every day of the week. I also sit on the 811 board of directors. And here at PECO, we are 100% locating contractor vendor. That makes sense.
Thank you, Pat. Sandy?
Good morning. I am Sandy Holmes. I am the Executive Director of Arizona 811. I've been in the industry for over 40 years and been on the CGA as a member since its inception. I was actually on the best practices study back in the late 90s. And I have, chaired a number of committees of the CGA, including early on the R&D committee and, the One Call Systems International. And in Arizona, we've had abandoned lines as part of our process at the 811 Center since the late 80s. So I'm really enjoying the thought of talking about it today.
Thank you, Sandy. Varun?
Yes, hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Varun Adipatla. I'm affiliated with the damage prevention industry, but I'm currently not working in a damage prevention company. I used to work for a company called Urbint that introduced concepts of machine learning and predictive analytics to damage prevention. And for 3 years, I worked alongside some of the largest utilities in North America to implement predictive technologies to help identify and mitigate damages through a variety of root causes. Currently affiliated with some work being done with gas pipelines and safety for a nonprofit. And thank you for being part of this.
Thank you, everyone. It's a very important topic. Let's start from the beginning, defining the problem. How do you define an abandoned facility? What is an abandoned facility? And what are the most common ones? Anyone feel free to jump in.
So I'll jump in. I'd say, for here at PECO, obviously we just do electric and gas. I know there's a ton of water out there that we come across, but for gas here at PECO, we do about 75 miles a year of capital replacement. We also do about 400 miles a year of cable replacement. And most of that cable runs in conduit. So I'd say our most, a lot of the calls we get are for the old cast iron, wrought iron pipe, trying to figure out, was it a gas or was it an electric line, a gas or a water line, and then all the conduit, especially down the city. All the conduit, who owns it? Can we rip it out? Are you going to reuse it? So I know with all the capital replacement we're doing, if it's not a big one now, all the conduit's going to be big in the next few years.
I could jump in as well. From a contractor's perspective, we have to take a very generic approach to this. So an abandoned facility to a contractor is any facility not identified on the plans or drawings given at the time of bid time. And when called in after being uncovered, it is also responded to by no actual entity tied to that ticket. So from a contractor's perspective, that line would then be considered abandoned.
From my perspective, Arizona law defines what an abandoned line is for the sake of getting them marked or getting them identified. And it actually defines it specifically as a facility that is no longer in service and physically disconnected from a portion of the facility or from any other facility that is still in use carrying service. So since they are disconnected, they cannot be marked using normal technologies that are typically used to mark facilities. And we'll get into what we do about that or why that's in our law, I think, in a little while. But I think that's the most important thing, is that when it truly is abandoned, it is disconnected and cannot be physically connected to mark through the normal channels.
I'll cap off the definition from a data perspective. Is really an abandoned facility is an unexpected event for an excavator to discover that something is not, and I think that has been said before, is when they're on site and they're digging up and they find a facility that has not part of the official record. It's an unexpected event, and from a risk perspective, that unexpected event needs to be treated, with caution, especially if it is a gas line. And so if I were quantifying the risk, an abandoned facility would definitely be a very high risk depending on the asset class given there. So if I were to model out the risk for an abandoned facility, I would say this is an unexpected event, which itself is a pretty risky event.
So, Varun, talking about, this question is for everyone, but following upon Varun's comment, talking about quantifying it, like what's the scale of the issue of abandoned facilities? Whether in your just experience, anecdotes, or are there numbers associated with it?
Yeah, and I know Sandra and her team at CGA. They've been, we at Urbint used to rely pretty heavily on the dirt report and we would dig deep, no pun intended, into the root causes, right? And of the latest dirt report, we saw. Sorry, I'm getting these notifications. My apologies. We saw that abandoned facilities account for about 1.2% of all damages across the industry. So it's not your big issue, but it's a growing issue, right? If you look at the data from year to year, it is an issue that is still at the bottom of the root cause. Just for perspective, the highest root cause is no call. And in fact, I spent a lot of time analyzing the reasons behind no call. But at least to answer the question, abandoned would say about 1.5% of the 140,000 damages, or 140 or 150,000 damages that occur in the United States every year.
Yeah, I mean, we can quantify it to a certain year here at PECO. Our Public Utility Commission required us to start tracking it in our GIS back in 2012. And so we do that. It's all tracked. It's in our GIS, and we're asked here in PA to make a reasonable effort to locate or to make known of the abandoned facility, whether it be in the design request or in a pre-construction meeting. But CGA, I think in like section 4.11 allows you to do the white paint, I think, for abandoned. We're not there yet. We don't do that. Just because a lot of the stuff is unknown. So, but yeah, we can quantify it back to 2012. I think the other thing that's hard too is, say for like electric, if we abandon a cable, sometimes we'll pull it out manhole to manhole, sometimes we'll leave the cable in, but a lot of times it's already in conduit. And we save a ton of money every year reusing the conduit. And we could pull the cable out and reuse the conduit. So it's hard to say like it's abandoned. Well, it's abandoned now. But if new construction comes along, or if we need to bring more load down the street for whatever reason, we're going to reuse that conduit. Now that's only electric, obviously. Gas, we're obviously not reusing the pipe, but so like I said, we're doing like 400 miles a year of cable replacement. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're just abandoning 400 miles of conduit.
And Pat, to your specific end right there, what we're finding on the contractor side is perhaps there's been a gas line that has been quote unquote abandoned, but we've seen, a fiber company or a cable company run right through that line itself. So we may even hear from the gas company, oh, our gas isn't live, but you break through it for any reason, you may run into another utility that's been basically illegally inside.
I've heard of people I've heard the fiber companies. I don't know if any of them are on here, but I've heard they do that. It's been a big issue. I think in PA, there's even been like Comcast will run a conduit and Verizon will come out and stick their cable through there. So yeah, unfortunately we don't really deal with that. Once the pipe's abandoned in place, we no longer take ownership of it. We have no problem coming out, and we do all the time, letting you know that it's our abandoned pipe if we know. But if we're unknown, unfortunately, if we can't give you an answer, then the risk and nobody responds to the one call ticket, then I think it's really up to the excavator, and it sucks to make it up to the excavator of how they're going to proceed.
And that's exactly the point, because I can tell you there's nothing that frustrates me more than you go through all of these hoops. You get all these people standing around. They're just like, well, I don't know. It's not on our drawings, so treat it as live. Meanwhile, you got an owner saying it's in my right of way. Rip that out, and we're putting in a manhole. And so then you have to decide, because the reality is it's our people who die first.
Yep.
There's something that Patrick said.
I'm
sorry. There's something that Patrick said that kind of struck a chord with me, and that is we started tracking it in 2012, and that's 2012 is many years after you started installing or abandoning facilities, but you had to start somewhere, and you did start somewhere. In Arizona, we do have a process for helping contractors get uncovered, unmarked lines identified as active or abandoned. And, we've been doing that for many years. Our laws required abandoned facilities to stay on facility owner maps since anything abandoned after December 31st, 1988. So we have probably in our state have installed and abandoned more facilities since then than were probably in the ground before then. So, that's a lot of record keeping that has been in place for a long time. So we had to start somewhere, and we thought we were behind the times when we were starting in 1988. So we do have a process, and I can quantify what the abandoned line exposure is in Arizona for those who report it. And we believe we're getting the reports because contractors know they cannot move forward if they find something and uncover it. In 2024, we processed 3,318 unknown lines. So far in 2025, it's 2,669 unknown lines, and in every one of those cases, they're reporting it to us. We're identifying qualified personnel from the utility companies based on the description that's been given to us, and we send them to the job site to visually inspect that uncovered facility to determine if it's active or abandoned. We first want to know who owns it, and then they can tell us if it's active or abandoned. If a facility owner claims it, and in 2025, 94% of the unknown lines or abandoned, or whether they're unknown or not abandoned or not abandoned, they're identified by an owner in the right away within the first 2 hours. So there's a 2-hour time frame on these requests. 94% of them are identified within the first 2 hours, and the contractor can move on. They're either identified as abandoned or active. The facility owner who identifies it can tell the contractor if it's abandoned, whether or not they can remove it, or if they have to work around it if they're trying to preserve it, as has been mentioned. Sometimes those facilities need to be preserved. And then if nobody identifies it in that first step, it moves on, and we have more processes in place to continue to identify them by doing a lot of research, sometimes in old documents, sometimes knocking on doors, right, where the facility owners are knocking on doors to ask about things that they're finding. So in 2025, 4% go on to that second step to determine if it's active or abandoned. And then there's a third step that sometimes requires the facility to be windowed to determine if it's active or abandoned. But out of those 2,669 so far this year, we've had 38 that have gone to that third step. Many times the contractor ends up finding a way to work around it if it can't be identified by then, because that third step can take maybe a day or two to try to figure out who owns it or what it is. But that's so that's a quantification for Arizona at least, and we've been doing it for a long time. It's the most high priority process we have in place, and we have 3 people who do pretty much 90% of their day is dealing with unknown lines.
So Sandy, those numbers warm my heart because I like numbers. What percent of, if you have it, what percent of these abandoned facilities, so 95 or unknown, 95% of the unknown are identified by the owner in the first 2 hours. What percent of those are identified as abandoned versus active? Do you have that?
It's a fairly small percentage. About 20% are identified as abandoned. The remaining are active facilities that were not marked.
Okay, that's great. Before we move on to the next question, do those numbers from Sandy surprise or inspire anyone? Any thoughts on those?
I'm surprised you have 80% of the people not coming out to mark their lines.
Well, and that to qualify for an unknown line, every facility owner listed on the ticket had to have provided a positive response to the ticket. So they've either already marked facilities that exist on the job, or they've indicated that they have no conflict in facilities with where the digging is going to occur. So they had to have received a response from every single facility owner listed on that ticket before we move to an unknown line process.
Yeah, my
I mean,
reaction to that.
And that's why I mentioned it's a records issue. This is a records issue.
We've in Ohio, since we've been working on the Underground Dam Prevention Coalition, the abandoned lines facility, like we have closely watched Arizona, because I do empathize greatly with facility owners, because there has to be a point forward line in the sand drawn. And the lamenting I get is that you're right. It's a massive lift. We can't go backwards and be reasonable to think that utility companies can even acquire all of that information, since some of it is through the acquiring of companies. And if you acquire a company with bad data, your data doesn't get any better. I get that perfectly. But knowing that the point forward, which I think really worked in Arizona, because if I recall correctly, Sandy, when we looked into the efforts that you guys had done, there was a moment in time, kind of a line drawn where, okay, from this point forward, you have to retain your data. And then there was an adjustment period to go ahead and get people on board. And I think that's the only reasonable path forward, because it will at least improve the conditions as we're putting lines in as quickly as possible. In Ohio, we've had an abandoned lines committee for almost 9 years, but we have accomplished nothing through legislation. And in the 9 years, I can't believe the amount of growth that we've seen even in Central Ohio. So the amount of facilities that have been put in and abandoned since then, we're just getting further behind the mark.
Mhm.
Yeah, and thank you, Sandra, for providing those numbers again, because one of the things that I picked up on is when we were building solutions for the excavator community, for the damage prevention manager community, one of the, things that we were saying is, okay, we understand that this is a records issue, but is there any possibility of being able to communicate likelihood or good enough data? So for example, when somebody goes out there and digs up the ground, can we be able to, is there a way to communicate to the excavator through the ticket, hey, excavator, you are entering into an area with a high likelihood of past abandoned facilities. So that what we were trying to do is, from a risk profile, convert an unknown unknown to a known unknown. And those are some of the most challenging things to do, right? Is like the unknown unknown is you digging and finding an abandoned facility. But from a solutions perspective, if I were to put on that ticket, hey, or if the positive response comes back and says, this area has a history of abandoned facilities, proceed with some caution, then there is some acknowledgement of some sort that there is this historical issue in this area, and that you are expected to encounter abandoned lines in this specific area. And I think there is some precedent in being able to do that. What we found in our data was that in older parts of cities, and most of the time we would work in urban areas. Yes, this might be a rural issue as well, but more concentrated in urban areas. The abandoned line issue was definitely correlated with certain census data, such as, I mean, this is kind of obvious, where if you had more building stock or older building stock in that area, so not greenfield, but historical areas, or facilities that were installed maybe in the 30s or the 40s, you are more likely to find abandoned facilities in those older areas, right? Of course, the fiber stuff completely changes that narrative. So it really depends on which asset class you're dealing with. There have been situations where during the 90s and the 2000s boom in fiber, there was this whole practice of installing dark fiber. So millions of miles of these so-called fiber for no reason was being put into the ground because it was a bubble. And so they would later find a lot of this fiber just put in the ground there, and nobody knew what it was all about. But I think what I'm trying to essentially say, yes, I completely agree with Sandra that it is absolutely a records issue. However, given the title of this conversation is like, we're not, kicking the can down the road. I think one potential way of moving forward here is asking the question, what is good enough data that we can put out there, acknowledging that this is a records issue. We're not going to be at perfect, but is there a way that you can move forward and actually think about abandoned facilities differently?
Yeah, I think there's a heavy lift there with trying to do that too, because you got to remember that a lot of utility companies, they may have internal locators. Some utility companies, if they have internal locators, they could be entry-level positions. So when they're responding to a ticket, they don't know that this is a heavy abandoned area facility. They don't know that. Or there's companies like PSE&G who I think do it great. It's actually a senior level position to be an internal locator. You actually have to know the stuff. So in that aspect, and I don't know if they're on the call or not, they are. I'm sure they'll be texting me any second, but I think they do it great. It's a senior level position. You need to have at least, I think, 10 years of experience or something over there to be an internal locator. You may get a good response like that, like, hey, we've been known to get calls in this area for abandoned facilities. And then you have a company say like Pico, and I think some of the other excellent companies where we have a locating vendor. These locate vendors, they only look at the GIS. So the GIS can show you what's live. And if it's from 2012 and beyond, they'll see a great outline that'll show you the abandoned, but it's not in their contract to mention anything about the abandoned line. If they get a renote to come out and say, hey, we found this line, they can look at the GIS and be like, yeah, We have a 4-inch cast iron main that was over on the left side of the road. A lot of the dimensions I think we probably took off so the GIS is not over flooded with data so you can read it. But they are able to say that at the same, but that's really all they could say is, yeah, we did have an old 4-inch cast iron line over there in that area. But they're a locate company, they're a lot of times.
Along those lines, Pat, I think the elephant in the room, and I love Mary's quick story about the some companies using abandoned conduits to run their facilities through. I think the elephant in the room here is responsibility. The question of responsibility. Who, quote unquote, owns the abandoned facilities, right? If PECO, you're the only facility owner on here, but if PECO runs, something 50 years ago and then 10 years ago it's abandoned and it's not on your data that you give to your locating contractor and it gets hit or it delays Mary's company, I mean, who's responsible? Let's talk about that.
I think that's the big. PECO, we say we don't own it. We don't own it. We, we come across this with PennDOT all the time, Department of Transportation, and when they have a road widening job and we have an old facility in there, we tell them, listen, you guys want to take the risk of sawing into it to see if it's dead, and if you do that, rip it out. I don't care. Take a 400 series excavator and rip that thing right out. PECO doesn't own it. It's not our facility anymore.
So hold on. I have to follow up on that. So you can bury something in a public right of way 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Stop using it 10 years ago and say, I don't own it. And then, Mary's company excavator comes along and it delays her or whatever happened. I mean,
yeah.
Can you do that above ground also? Can you dump some stuff somewhere above ground 50 years ago, 10 years ago? Hey, I'm not using it anymore, but I'm leaving it there. And then I know I'm
the
not
biggest
putting
difference
on the spot,
is the biggest difference is PennDOT doesn't require us to remove it.
Okay.
So in Arizona, the facility owner
don't say you have to remove it, then we're not going to. And then if they want us to remove it, then that goes back to the PUC, to their commission.
Yeah.
Say, hey, we're going to have to increase all of Pennsylvania's rates because we need another $25 million to go remove all this stuff. If you want us to do that, that's fine. But it's not a requirement as of today,
I hear that all the time as a contractor, and my challenge back is that it's not that the money doesn't get spent, it gets shifted to other people because the group of stakeholders we can't seem to get super engaged in this, which bewilders me, is the large municipalities who own the right-of-ways, who are basically leasing the rights for these utilities to go in them. There's a lot of simplicity that can come because they have a lot of power in this process. Realistically, they're the ones telling us we own the right-of-way, rip it out. I don't know if it has residual gas in it. I don't know if it has enough to hurt a person. We don't have that kind of information. But if we could engage that stakeholder to recognize that it's something I do think we're going to have to legislate, because when we say, oh, it's really expensive to do that, it is. So is the delay. So is the change order that comes to the municipality who passes that amount of money and that expense on to other people as well, because one way or the other, that new project is going in. Yeah. And it may be a design change or it may be construction.
The issue needs to be dealt from multiple sides. So in our law, the facility owner owns those abandoned facilities still. They're still responsible for keeping them on their maps. They're responsible for informing an excavator when they're going to be digging in an area where there are abandoned facilities. They cannot mark them specifically, as we mentioned, because they're disconnected. However, they have to tell the excavator that abandoned facilities are in the area. Many of them will use an A with a circle around it to identify that they are in the area and the color specified for that utility type. Then the excavator cannot move forward if they find a facility, if they uncover a facility that they weren't expecting. They have to notify the 811 center when that happens. So that is part of the law as well. And then we have the process in place to send those qualified people out there. But the facility owner remains the owner of them. even when they abandon the whole pipeline or whatever it is. So we've had pipelines abandoned in the state, and they still have to identify those facilities when somebody uncovers it to ensure that it is that abandoned facility. So if the facility, somebody has to claim it so that the excavator can move forward. We specifically enforce the fact that an excavator cannot remove a facility that is suspected to be abandoned unless it is 100% verified to be abandoned. And the permission was given by the facility owner who originally owned it. So, I think that's where some risk comes in, is if somebody thinks that there's abandoned facilities out there, and then they assume that it's the abandoned facility that was uncovered, and they tear it out, and it puts them and others in the community in danger. So, that is why we have that specific process in place, so that does not happen. And our process is certainly far from perfect, because there's a lot of it happening. However, it does help the excavator to be able to move on in a job. And I think that's where, the excavators get some relief in that process, because we are assisting them to identify it. And then, 38 cases, they may not have identified specifically who it was. And they, some of them probably had to be assumed to be active because they could not be windowed, or, no origination point could be identified. But, that's 38 out of, we, processed 968,000 transactions last year. So that's 38 out of 968 transactions. That's not a bad record, right? So, it's a matter of making sure that contractor can move on is really, where our point is.
So, great discussion, guys. Sorry, go ahead, Varun.
Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to add, in my urban tech research, I try to look at other areas outside of just damage prevention and pipelines and things like that. So New Jersey presents an interesting case study, right? New Jersey has the underground storage tank problem, UST problem, right? And the way they tackled that is because it was a clear and present environmental issue because of the leaking oil that was causing issues with the groundwater, right? And so, it was a 60 Minutes episode in the 1970s. There was political will. It sort of, the threat was pretty clear, and it was affecting communities. And so people got together, and apparently there's this fund called the Clean Storage. It's called the Remediation Fund, which is, it's funded through a tax. It's funded through a tax on businesses, and that money goes into abatement and remediation of these underground storage tanks. So that's a system that's been in place where, there is no accountability, but at least there has been political will and funding to essentially make progress in addressing the problem and acknowledging it. So given these types of situations, I think, Jamie, where you sort of implied that there's an accountability problem here, but also the risk is not clear and present risk, right? Unless you've encountered an abandoned line that ends up being an active service, which, if you look at Sandra's data, it says that 20% of the time you will find an abandoned gas line that is still active, maybe even lower. But if you're dealing with those risk numbers, it's not a question of if, but when that's going to happen. And, in the public policy world, those are called policy windows. And, some people may call it crisis actors, but when those events happen, I think it's really important to organize, like, outside of this community, get the politicians interested, because their attention spans are like the size of peanuts. So when those events happen, that's your opportunity to engage this legislative process and say, look, here's an opportunity for us to rethink this abandoned facility stuff and actually move forward here.
Great point. So Pat made a great point about, look, this is law in Pennsylvania. We're very happy to comply with law, and ultimately it's paid for by ratepayers. So back to Sandy, that's related to Sandy, because Sandy, it sounds like Arizona is ahead of the curve. You and Arizona and the laws are ahead of the curve of most or many or maybe all the other states in regards to abandoned facilities. What, if any, were there incidents or cases, or what triggered, I guess, some of this legislation and regulations regarding abandoned facilities in Arizona? Like, what were the triggers for those innovations, I guess?
Enormous growth. In the, when this started, so in the 90s, we had 10, 15,000 people a month moving into the county. And, it started as a process in, in the Maricopa County area, which is where about 70% of our ticket volume occurs. But, all of that housing development being installed, required a lot of those old abandoned, many times ag facilities to be identified and to be, taken care of during that process. And then, as I mentioned, installing and abandoning and reinstalling and then abandoning, we probably had more facilities abandoned, installed and abandoned since then than we had in the ground at the time that this started. So they knew, we've had visionaries in our midst for many years in Arizona, dating way back into the 70s when they started the 811, whatever the blue stake or one call process way back then. They just knew that it was going to be a problem, and they decided to tackle it, and they knew they had to start at some point. So they decided to start then, especially with knowing how many developments were in the beginning
Right.
stages.
So it
and our
sounds
state is
like,
basically master planned, so we don't have ancient things in the ground like many of the other states do. Our state was pretty much master planned because of the water usage situation.
so
Yeah, and I
it
think
sounds
that's a
like,
big difference too,
go ahead,
Jemmy,
Pat.
is like,
Yeah.
here in Philadelphia, like we have pre-1900 lines, and then if we replace them in the 70s, so like I said, in PA, we start in 2012, we have all of our gas and electric accounted for, both retired or abandoned, and obviously the new. But we don't have record of it back in the day because you have these old cities, and they've been replacing stuff for many, many decades before, hell, even computers. So a lot of it's paper, and a lot of it's trying to, everything that was able to be digitalized and scanned in, a lot of it was. But I mean, I have two people that work full time here, and all they do is go back through our old field books for our problem locates. Like I literally pay two people a good salary to go back and look at field books that were all hand drawn in, just to tell people if if it's abandoned or if it actually is ours. Because there's also the risk that we don't even know that the gas line is over there. Obviously, that's a very, very low risk, but anything's possible. Things get missed throughout the years. An
I think
as-built wasn't turned in, and unfortunately that happens. But we recognize that, so we hire people and we put processes in place to try to, remediate that issue.
and I think the point there again is you there's not much you can do about the old abandoned facilities, but you have to start somewhere keeping track of the ones that are newly abandoned, right? And you started doing that in 2012. That's still many years of history you've got, taken care of, really. So I think it's people
Yeah.
have to stop looking backward too far and start moving
Well, to your
forward and
point, it
counting
came with the
today.
growth. And in
Mhm.
2012 is when PICO started their huge LTIP, their long-term improvement plan. That's when we started getting the massive $1 billion funding to update all of our facilities, to upgrade them, to do all the big replacement programs. That's when it started. So that's when the commission was like, this is when, you also need to start keeping track of everything that was abandoned. Before that, we'd replace, 10 miles a year of just our leaking cast iron. But like I said, and then 2012 came, now it started with 50 miles, and then the same thing with the cable replacement. So when you have this huge type of growth and huge type of replacement programs in place, you really should try to keep track of the old. It's hard
So,
and it's costly, but
right. So let me play devil's advocate here. Um, this sounds like it was and is a bigger problem in places like Arizona, where there's very high population percent and numbers wise growth and construction, per capita and all that. Maybe, and I'm playing devil's advocate, maybe in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania, where Mary, you're headquartered in Ohio, maybe in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania, it's a loud problem, but it's not a big problem. And maybe the most economic solution is what's going on right now, which is, hey, we don't know anything. And if you, Mary's company, encounters abandoned facilities, well, you got to deal with it and you incur the cost. But this is the most economic way to deal with it in these slower or flat population line states. I mean, maybe that's what's going on, and maybe that is the most optimal solution. Again, just devil's advocate.
For Ohio, I think we're going to have to legislate it. We don't have enough alignment on shared responsibility. Like, I love to hear things like Pat is saying about what his company is committed to. The problem is we don't have enough of them. We don't have enough people committed to doing that. And I'm very worried specifically about the utilities that are going to kill our people. But I think we're missing this shared responsibility and this cooperation we could achieve because, we're talking about all the effort that Pat's having to put into it on the utility side. And there's no doubt about it that that's costly and expensive. And it's a lot of people involved and a lot of time. But you also have contractors finding this stuff. So if we find it, a lot of us are also like the Pats of the world. We're sophisticated enough where we can take information, we can give you coordinates, we can give you photographs, we can give you data that can ultimately be held by a third party like the 811 centers, where that information can begin to be compiled into something that could make sense. It's a heavy lift. It would take a long time, but it has to be a point forward. I look at Ohio and I look at some of the gas companies we have on our abandoned lines committee. We've been on it for 9 years. Some of them still aren't tracking it, and we've been talking to them about it for 9 years. There are certain companies that are absolutely committed to not moving this process forward because they don't want to spend the money. That part's going to have to be legislative, but I also think contractors are going to have to be willing to, as we encounter this stuff, we have to give up the data to a central place who can store it and begin it to make it make sense as to where it is, so you have a little bit better of an idea. Because when we say things like to contractors, go ahead and treat it as live or treat it as sensitive, we're building up this apathy that these lines aren't dangerous because they work around so many of them where nothing comes of it. I mean, Ohio's seen explosive growth, especially in the central Ohio area, and we haven't seen people committed to it. I mean, I'm on projects that we've been on for 5 and 6 years where there are lines that have been installed and abandoned in the course of the project. And nobody is marking it and nobody is keeping this information, and it's going to kill someone.
Yeah, so I thank you I just want to step in here. I just pulled up the last major incident that involved an abandoned facility from the NTSB records. It was in Youngstown, Ohio in May 2024, right? That was the root cause of that after the NTSB investigation was abandoned facility, right? There's this concept in the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, called anti-fragility. Anti-fragility is anytime a disastrous event happened, there needs to be an acknowledgement by all parties involved that things need to change, right? And that's where I think that we ought to be anytime there's an issue in the high consequence area with abandoned facilities involved. It needs to be like, horns need to be blaring saying things need to change, right? I also want to say on the other side, the shared services. So there is some legislative precedent on shared services, right? So what's interesting, actually not legislative precedent, Massachusetts, the city of Lawrence and Columbia Gas, long time ago, the city of Lawrence water department did a shared services agreement with Columbia Gas to relocate their facilities, right? It was the first time somebody did that, right? But it was basically saying that, hey, you need to put your gas line there, but our water pipe is there. So the gas company paid the water company to relocate so that they would spend lesser money in basically implanting their. So it's those types of coordination agreements that I think the business community needs to figure out, because if you are able to quantify the delays, the costs from the excavator community, if someone is able to quantify, here's your abandoned line problem in dollars and cents, right? And if you make this investment, right, they will be matching funds from maybe the public authorities, and we can start solving this problem. Lastly, I'll say, it's funny. It's not funny, but uh, in America, we call it abandoned lines, right? But in the UK and Europe, it's called ordnance survey. Why? Because the abandoned facilities were actual bombs from World War II, right? These were abandoned ordnance, and in England, it kicked off a huge geospatial commission that ended up becoming the National Underground Asset Register, right? Which was a national commitment to solve the records problem. Why? Because they wanted to know where all the unexploded ordnance or bombs were from World War II. That's what kicked off the legislative procedure to get things changed in Europe and the UK.
I also want to think that, or talk about, and I know this adds cost to the project ultimately, but in PA, they're really driving the SUE, subsurface utility engineering. So, and this is all in the design phase. So, there's obviously different levels. I don't know if it's the same everywhere, but, here in PA, it's A, B, C, and D. I think it's pretty common. D is next to nothing. A is basically you're going out in your test hole. And PA, they're really pushing, like you get, the commission will fine you pretty harsh if you're not doing A and B. Now, obviously, B is you're looking at maps, you're going to pull manholes, you're actually looking to get in elevations. But A is like, it's test holing your path. It's actually doing the full scope of the design. You're going out there and you're looking for a clear path to install whatever facility you're doing. And I think it's great, because you have the utilities involved, you have the contractor involved, you have a design firm involved, and ultimately, if the design is done correctly, you're going to handle a lot of issues. So when it gets to Mary, a lot of the issues that she won't have to deal with. Obviously, nothing's perfect, but doing SUE level A up front is definitely beneficial. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't talk about is looking at it, when the project first gets designed. And then, who's going to pay for it? Well, whoever's putting the project on, ultimately. I mean, it's the same thing for the utilities. People forget the utilities are the largest excavation companies usually in the state. We have 3,500 people that move dirt every day. Our sister companies, ComEd, BG&E, they got thousands of employees who are moving soil every day. We are the largest excavator in the state. So if you think about it that way, we spend millions and millions designing our jobs. And we have vac trucks that run every day designing. We're trying to make it easier for the install. And I think, if a township wants to replace the sewer, yeah, it's going to cost, but either that or they're going to pay Mary's company a change order for downtime or having to put in offsets, or they just pay it up front and have the design company go and do it. That way, if something goes wrong, they can actually go back to the design company and be like, hey, you owe Mary's company money because we asked you to design a clear path for them and you didn't do it. I know that sounds so simple, but, it's kind of like putting the project, making sure that it's done correctly from the start.
That's great. Thank you, Pat.
Jimmy,
Varun mentioned, yes, please go ahead.
I'll say, if you don't mind, there's a couple comments in the chat that
Yep.
maybe I could address.
Oh, okay.
One is that facilities that are abandoned and kept on their maps could be still considered taxable. We've dealt with that here, but there's a very specific difference between an abandoned facility on a map so that facility owners are not taxed. They keep track of them for the purpose of of what we've been talking about all morning. So, a lot of facility owners have tried to use that excuse for not keeping facilities on their maps, but I think we took care of that in law to make that not prevalent here. And then the other comment was about a facility owner. Is a facility owner liable for designating something as abandoned and their own, I suppose, when it actually turns out to be somebody else's and it's not abandoned, it's live, and the contractor cuts it? I can tell you from experience, our facility owners do not accept responsibility for a facility they do not know is theirs. They they will only accept responsibility for facilities that they know they own. So, that would be a rare occasion. If somebody does not claim it as their own and they know for sure and they actually visually inspect it and know that it's their own, they will disown it basically. And, at some point in time, it could be necessary for the facility or for the excavator to work around a facility because we have to consider it live. But nobody claims a facility that's not there. So if that happens, it's out of real ignorance out of the person who's claimed it. And most of the facilities, most of the abandoned facilities get inspected by somebody with a higher level of knowledge than maybe the entry level locator. If we were talking about the levels of locators, so it's usually somebody at a higher level that is inspecting the facility to determine if it's theirs.
Thank
And
you
a very
very
high
much, Sandy.
percentage of the live ones or even the abandoned ones do turn out to be communications, probably because there is more of that being abandoned than many of the others.
Awesome. And thank you for monitoring the comments for the
Sorry.
town hall. No, thank you. I have two quick questions I want to get to before time runs out. Time flies when you're having fun. If you can give quick answers to this. First, I have to talk. Varun's mentioned data science a few times, and Sandy's talked about data, which I want to tie data science technology because I think they're intertwined. What's the role of technology and data science and data in this problem as a solution or part of a solution to it? What can be done from that part? And if you can give a quick answer, because I have one more question for all before we end this. Thank you.
Sandy, do you want to go first?
Well, no, I'm gonna let you go first because I want to formulate a good answer for what he just asked because there's a lot to put together there.
As a data scientist, one of the things when I entered, I agreed that I was very new. Back in 2019 was when I entered the damage prevention space. I was attending AGA conferences and picking up so much knowledge from this. There were two things that came. One was the lead effort in Michigan. There was a lot of the lead pipes in Michigan. There's a lot of data science to predict where the lead lines could be. And I think there's a lot of interesting insights that came out of there, a lot of interesting technology, because there's a lot of water data is also really bad. And when it comes to a records problem, there's not a lot of good records around water data. And then the second thing that that comes to mind is there was a company, maybe still is a company called Fracta, which also in the water world, they did some very interesting. What they did is they said, okay, we found an abandoned facility here. What is the likelihood that some other area is going to have this abandoned, the same type of problem? And what they would do is they would run algorithms to say how similar is this area to that area, given that we know that this is a problem caused by, urbanity, like old buildings, right? So in a city that's kind of growing in interesting ways, the question that they were asking was, where are the other older areas in the city? And then mark that part of the city with the same risk profile. So those were some sort of proactive approaches that were being done at the data science level. Of course, there's hardware. I know a lot of people love hardware and scanning things and guns and do all sorts of stuff that survey stuff. I think that's also helpful and useful. There's a place for that to solve the records issue, but I do think there's a place for data science to come up with creatively identifying abandoned assets, and I think that should be part of the conversation as well.
So when we get a facility uncovered because it was not marked during this process, if it hits step 2 and we have not been able to identify an owner, we're looking at recent excavations to determine if something was installed and has not been added to the asset field, right? So we're using the data in the ticket system to determine, and we're contacting the contractors potentially or the or the owners of, or the owners of those projects, and sending them out there because they may not be considered facility owners at the time when they're installing it. So there have been several times where it has turned out to be a newly installed facility that was uncovered and not marked. So, and it's not the typical facility owner that we're utilizing for that, it's the contractor who installed it. So, from that perspective, we're able to visualize all of the dig sites in the area and where the abandoned, or where the uncovered facility was found, and determine, and start making contact with those people. And we have found that has been the case a number of times. And I think that's growing, especially with the fiber projects that have been going in.
Thank you very much. Pat and Mary, anything to add before we go to the final question? If not, it's okay.
No,
Technology.
not from, no.
Okay. All right. Cool, thank you. So final question, call to action. Looking ahead 3 to 5 years, what's the single most important action thing that the industry can do, whether it's technology, policy, standards, whatever, to improve, right? Not to achieve perfection, right? But to, and Sandy's said this many times about, we don't have to go back to the 1800s or whatever, but to start somewhere to improve the situation. What's the one thing you would recommend?
I mean, to me, you just said it. You got to start. You have to start. We started in 2012. I think there's other utilities in the state still have not started it. There's a lot of utilities that are owned by the municipality that have very small budgets. They have minimal GIS mapping, as-built technology. Some don't even care still. I think I even saw it in the chat. As-built and accurate as-builts are not a requirement. Here at PECO, we have a whole team of people that oversee the as-built process and oversee making sure that the as-built process matches what the design was. And if there's not, there better be an RFI that goes with it. So you got to start somewhere. It's too bad if you're starting now in 2025 or in 2026, that stinks. It hurts the contractor community. It hurts the excavator community. But I'll also say kudos that you're recognizing it and starting it. And, if you're able to look back in the past, maybe 5 to 10 years to try to add those to your GIS, you should. If you're not, just the easiest thing to do is have your GIS team just gray out what was retired and highlight what's new. It doesn't require much effort on the back end to just gray out the facility and leave it on your GIS. I think it's tricky though, if you want to add it to your locating. I think you got to really work with your commission and know how do you want to locate it, how you want to label it, how you want to pay for it. Those are all just bigger questions that can be answered. You just need the answers to them. I don't know if many people are just going to jump into it without getting those answers. So, but I think you just nailed it there. It's just start doing it, start tracking it, don't delete it.
And really, trying to go back and re-add things to the map that are abandoned, that's where the costs come in. Actually, just switching the nomenclature of an asset on digital maps from active to abandoned, that seems much more reasonable and definitely not as many costs involved in that. I don't think cost is an issue. It should be an issue.
Really quickly, near misses. Here's the big thing. I would love to propose a legislation that says if you find an abandoned active in a high consequence area, that should be a security stand down. Get everybody on the table, get that abandoned asset onto a map so that it never happens again. So near misses are really important. And in safety culture, I run a fleet of 900 school buses here in New York City. If we have a near miss, we need to stop and talk about it And that needs to happen at the legislative level, that people need to talk about it when there's a near miss so that you don't have another Youngstown, Ohio in 2024 and keep our community safe. Yeah.
I agree completely from a contractor's perspective. It's about legislation from point forward, and it has to happen because goodwill has not gotten us far enough.
All right, and with that, I want to thank the panelists for a very insightful discussion on this very important topic, and I want to thank all of you for getting on this panel, town hall, and Roger and Tyler at Axe for making this happen.